I'm Marc, and on this channel I talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view, although I do know the UK from the inside as well. And this week my channel is all about Brexit future discussions. Even if many people just don't want to hear the B word anymore, it still has an impact on the political landscape in Great Britain, but especially on the people in the country. One of the ongoing discussions revolves around the nature of the British future relationship with the EU. We hear a lot about this. The trade and cooperation agreement already exists, but other models are still being discussed in public today. And today I would like to talk about one of those models. And today it's about Norway. The trade relations between Norway and the European Union, the EU, are regulated by the European Economic Area Agreement. This agreement creates a close link between Norway, which is not an EU member, and the EU's internal market. And there are some quite important points. Norway, along with Iceland and Liechtenstein, is a member of the EEA, which ensures these countries' access to the EU's internal market. The EEA agreement allows Norway to have almost unrestricted access to the markets of EU member states, and vice versa. EU member states have access to the Norwegian market. The free movement of goods is a central part of the EEA agreement. And this means that there are no tariffs, quotas, or other trade barriers for the majority of trade in goods between Norway and the EU. However, certain products, such as agricultural and fishery products, are affected by special regulations. Norway incorporates a large number of EU directives and regulations into national law under the EEA agreement, especially those that affect the internal market, for example, in the areas of competition, state aid, public procurement, environmental protection, or occupational safety. However, Norway does not have formal co-decision in EU legislation, but is only involved in consultation processes. As part of the EEA, Norway makes financial contributions to contribute to economic and social cohesion in the less developed regions of the EU. In addition to the EEA agreement, there are special bilateral agreements between Norway and the EU that cover areas not included in the EEA agreement, as I said, such as fisheries, agriculture, justice and home affairs. The EEA agreement is thus the central pillar that defines the trade relationship between Norway and the EU, and it allows Norway to be closely linked to the EU without being a member. The trade relationship between Norway and the EU, governed by the European Economic Area Agreement, offers both advantages and also indeed disadvantages for Norway. And first, of course, I want to talk about the advantages here. Norway has almost unrestricted access to the EU's internal market, which makes it much easier to export goods and services to the EU. Yes, also services. This is especially important as the EU is Norway's largest trading partner. By having access to the internal market and participating in a large economic area, Norwegian companies benefit from a stable and predictable economic environment which promotes economic growth. Norwegian citizens can move, live and work freely in the EU, which gives them significant personal and professional freedoms. Norway adopts many of the EU standards and regulations, which often lead to higher consumer, environmental and occupational health and safety standards. Although Norway has no formal say in EU legislation, it is included in many consultations and thus has the opportunity at least to indirectly influence decisions. But there are of course also disadvantages. One often cited disadvantage is that Norway has no say in the EU legislation it is required to adopt through the EEA agreement. It has no voting rights in the European Parliament or the European Council. And Norway makes significant financial contributions to the EU, particularly to promote economic and social cohesion in less developed regions of the EU, as I mentioned earlier, without being a member itself and thus without direct influence on how these funds are used. And Norway must adopt many EU laws and regulations, which in some cases is seen as a restriction on national sovereignty, especially when these regulations are not in Norway's best interests at the first place. Despite access to the internal market, Norway faces restrictions in certain sectors as agriculture and fisheries, as I said, where special agreements are required and quotas still apply. Adopting EU rules can be costly for business and the government, especially when it comes to adapting to quite more, let's say, complex regulations. But the EEA agreement offers Norway many advantages, notably access to the internal market and participation in a large economic area without being a full member of the EU. However, the price Norway has to pay is that it has to adopt EU laws without having a say in them, and that it has to make financial contributions without having direct influence on their use. These arrangements reflect Norway's decision to be closely linked economically to the EU while maintaining its political independence. After Brexit, the question is whether the United Kingdom could establish a similar relationship with the EU as Norway has under the European Economic Area Agreement. And that's now all hypothetical what's coming. In theory, this would be possible, but it would bring with it several specific conditions and challenges. But what would be the theoretical requirements for the UK to join the EEA then? Well, to join the EEA, the UK would first have to become a member of EFTA, as the EEA is only open to EFTA states, which are Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and EU member states. EFTA membership would mean that the UK would benefit from free trade agreements that EFTA has concluded with other countries and regions. However, the UK would also be bound by certain obligations within EFTA. Like Norway, the UK would have to adopt much of EU law, particularly in areas affecting the internal market, such as competition law, consumer protection, environmental regulations, and workers' rights. And it would have to commit to adopting EU law without having a formal say in EU legislation. A key condition for access to the EU internal market is the free movement of people, and the UK would have to accept this commitment, which is a politically sensitive issue after Brexit, as control over immigration was a key concern for British voters. And the UK would have to make financial contributions to support economic and social cohesion in the EU, similar to what Norway does. However, these contributions would be lower than what an EU member would have to make. And the UK would not have a seat in the European Parliament or the Council of the European Union, and thus would not have a direct say in EU laws. This would be a significant limitation compared to previous EU membership. And like Norway, the UK might have to negotiate special agreements for certain sectors, for example agriculture and fisheries, to ensure that these areas are regulated according to its needs. And of course, there are indeed some political and practical challenges when you think about this. A return to the EEA, coupled with the need to adopt EU law and accept free movement of people, could face political resistance, as many of the Brexit supporters wanted to prevent exactly this. And the EU would have to agree to grant the UK such a relationship, plus Norway, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. After the difficult negotiations of the Brexit agreement, there may be skepticism about whether the UK is actually interested in such terms in the long term. A special agreement for the UK could arouse covetousness in other EU member states as well, which could demand similar exemptions, which the EU definitely wants to avoid. So theoretically, the UK could establish a similar relationship with the EU as Norway does under the EEA agreement. However, this would require the UK to become an EFTA member, and accept the conditions that come with it, including the adoption of EU law and free movement of people. However, the political feasibility and the will of the British government and people to accept such terms are questionable, and the willingness of the EU to support such an arrangement would also play a crucial role, because I have major doubts that either them or the other EEA members would agree to that. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.